We also strengthen in the near future, we're also planning to assist our countries in basically streamlining tax incentives and implementing regional harmonized measures to quantify their costs. We're also planning to assist in implementing strategies to renegotiate extractive contracts and make them public. We're also planning to improve the existing tax treaties, especially those that lead to an erosion of our tax base, with the aim of protecting our domestic tax rights. But we're not only going to those countries and assisting them in tackling these key factors, we also negotiated tax contracts and non-transparent concessions in the extractive industry. The inadequate taxation of high net worth individuals and the disconnect between tax policy and tax administration that actually results in weak tax administration and weak policies and resistance. To our countries and implementing these approaches. We also have developed international tax tools and products that are based on global tax standards and best practice, but also tailor-made to respond to our own specific needs. And those products include the African model on drafting transfer pricing legislation, the African model to draft interest deductibility. Also the African model to basically assess risk, assess risk in the transfer pricing, as well as the ATAF model agreement on the double tax agreement. So those are the various tools that our tax administration, our member countries have in place to assist them in strengthening their domestic legislation and thus fighting and tackling illicit financial flows. We also are using the ATAF unique position as the continent's leading continental tax body to influence global tax standard setting at the international level through our participation at the OECD on the OECD BEPS project, the inclusive framework, as well as the United Nations technical committees. So please allow me now, just while I'm concluding, to present some of the impacts that these initiatives have had on the ground. For example, through our 20 country programs that we are actually implementing on transfer pricing, exchange of information, and also the strengthening of the capacity of the auditors in tax administration, we have managed to basically assist some countries in passing new legislation. For example, the Republic of Malawi has recently passed through Parliament the new transfer pricing legislation we assisted them in strengthening and implementing. And the government of Zambia has also published recently the new transfer pricing regulation. And of course, the Republic of Liberia and Nigeria have signed the ATAF mutual agreement on tax matter. We're actually calling it the tool that allows for tax inspector without border in Africa, where basically it allows for exchange of information, joint audit, and joint investigation among our countries as long as it is ratified, which it is right now. In terms of revenue, additional revenue gain, we have, for example, managed to assist Rwanda in collecting an additional $8 million. In an East African country that we are not allowed to name at the moment, we have managed to collect an additional $9 million USD. And in the West African countries, we have collected an additional 30 million and in excess of 500 million tax in assessment. So as you can see, if we implement those tools, we are able through our own measures and our own approaches to actually tackle the issues of IFF in our continent. So based on that, we would like to also conclude by saying that it's very important to deal with IFF, especially the major component of IFF, which comes from the international commercial transaction, mostly by multinational enterprises, by encouraging inter-country cooperation coordinated at the continental level. And that can be done by, for example, calling African leaders at the African Union level to basically endorse the work that ATAF is already doing, especially through the consortium, to institutionalize, to endorse ATAF as that African Union specialized agencies to actually institutionalize inter-country and regional task cooperation and develop also African standard that will protect not only our tax base, but also maximize domestic resource mobilization on the continent while promoting foreign direct investment without having one at the expense of the other. So basically that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nara. Before we go to our next speaker, allow me to recognize Honorable Keno Foriata, Minister of Finance of Ghana. Welcome, Minister. Also, I would like to recognize the present among us of Ambassador Bankole, PR of Nigeria to AU and ECA and Ethiopia, and also Mr. John Tubula from Republic of Benin. Welcome, sir. Our next speaker is Mr. Olaf Lundestål, Policy Director for Tax and Capital Flight, NORAD, I think, Norwegian Agency of Development Cooperation. Olaf. In this part of Africa, we always, probably when you say Olaf, the thing that comes to our mind is Olaf Palme, your next door neighbor. This is the interpreter note. I don't know. Okay, so Olaf, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Of course, the expectation with comparison with Olof Palme, I will not. Of course, we all admire him a lot, and in the Nordic countries and as well in Norway, he's an icon in many ways. Just many thanks for the invitation, and I think I would like to say on behalf of Government of Norway also that we have appreciated for a long time the partnership that we have had and that we have nurtured, I think, with UNECA, with AU as well. We have sort of a special place in our heart for the work that was done by the Mbeki panel. It still is something that is recognized and remembered as a breakthrough, and I think at the global level this really had a huge impact in terms of anchoring this discussion. So we are very happy to be here. We are hoping to sort of increase our efforts again as well in this area. We have always been on the agenda, but I think it's now coming up with strength, also in the current government, more than in the past few years, I would say. So I would like to take a bit of time. Maybe it's not necessary in this audience, but I think it's important, especially coming from a development agency in the I always like to spend a bit of time on the backdrop anyway, because I think it's so convincing in what we are discussing today when it comes to the potential of DRM and IFF in the developing world and in Africa specifically. We are at the point in history where we can look back at the last 100 years and development is happening faster than ever before. So today it's possible, for example, at 1/10 of the income level to have the same level of life expectancy as you would see in the 19th century. So with adjusting for price differences, you can actually have 1/10 of the GDP per capita and live the same amount of years you would do in the 19th century. So there has been tremendous change in terms of technology, in terms of investment in health and education, and development of institutions and of government in many countries, including in Africa, where life expectancy has doubled over the last 100 years, similar to trends you have seen in other regions. So there is an opportunity in front of us, and I think there is a recognition also increasingly in the northern and western world that the role of government, the discussion is coming back. There was a bit in the 80s and 90s a thinking that government should be very small, it should not be overemphasized. I think this is, if you look at the history of the West itself, it's wrong. I mean, if you look at how the West emerged, it's clear that taxes and the building of government were at the core of the success of any developed country, really. And you can look at the numbers. I mean, look at, you know, tax collection to social sectors went from 1% of GDP to 25% in the OECD area over a 100-year period. And it went hand in hand with higher growth, higher productivity. So there's no contradiction there. And then at the same time, any country throughout history that has developed and had economic transformation has based that mainly on its own domestic resources. You might have for periods some exceptions, but that's in general the rule throughout history. And it's interesting to note, and of course being here at UNECA, you are very well aware of this, you have written many reports on this, that it is clear already the last 30 to 40 years that financing and funding of development in Africa is coming from African sources. So if you look at the report by Leon Sendikumana, for example, from 2015, clearly shows that even if you look at what decides level of investments, it's mainly African saving and African credit of a factor of 10 to 1 if you look at the average. Now, of course, many of you will say that the average hides a lot of details, and that's true, and I will come back to that to some extent. But it's still very strong, and it's something that very few, I think, in the West and in the North are aware of, actually. So, and similar to tax and domestic revenue mobilization, if you look at private consumption, public expenditure, it's similar. I mean, and the ratios have been increasing in the benefit of African sources dominating. So going back 15 years, it was about 3 to 1. So African tax collection explained 3 times more than aid and remittances, for example. Today it's 5 to 1. And this is in a period where aid has actually increased quite a lot. Aid has grown in many areas and many regions, including in Africa. But tax collection in Africa has grown more, and much more, and outgrown the other sources. Still, of course, there are differences. There are fragile countries, there are countries where this is not the case, and where aid remains more dominant and could be above 10% of GDP and could be very critical to public expenditure. And going forward, of course, we need to be mindful of that and need to take into consideration the differences and the dynamic role that aid could play and should play in many countries. And then I want to go into another one that is linked to what we're discussing today on IFF, and that is that at independence, resource-rich countries in Africa, according to Richard Auty, had a 50% higher median income level than the rest of the countries in the region. Today, half of the population in Africa live in resource-rich but income-poor countries with similar income levels and poverty levels as the other countries. So there has been a very big change there. This is linked to the resource curves. It's linked to the discussion on IFF. It's linked to also fiscal management. It's linked to issues of corruption and all the issues that we have on the table. And Africa, as you all know, and UNECA and many of you here have published many good reports on this, is the region and where you find many of the countries where illicit financial flows and also capital flight that Leon Sendikumana writes about, which is a slightly bigger bag in a way, is very important. I mean, according to Sendikumana, from 1970 to 2010, capital flight from 39 countries in Africa was 95% of FDI, all FDI and ODA in this period. And in relative terms, Africa has still the lowest private capital stock per worker of any developing region. Many countries have very low capital stock, has its highest percentage of the private capital held abroad as well, highest net external stock of capital in relation to its debt. In 2010, it was 3 times. So it's obvious that there are big potentials here and big issues that need to be dealt with. And UNECA had an excellent report in 2016 on corruption, where it was also clearly shown that a lot of the corruption is linked to cross-border trade and financial activity. And in most cases, it was about 99%, Western companies are involved. But colluding with someone, but clearly there is a large blame on the Western companies and also a responsibility on Western governments how to deal with this situation. And then I want to briefly then get into strategies or resource mobilization. And it was mentioned to some extent by Nara already and also in the introduction, but as far as we see, the domestic potential is still by far the largest potential. Estimates vary between 3 to 10% of GDP in medium term, without disturbing savings and investment and the business environment. But of course, any domestic resource mobilization effort is closely linked to the international. It's sort of a symbiosis in many ways, if you want. If you make progress in one or the other, it can have a potential positive synergy effect. The second point is perhaps that it is the policy area, interpreted a bit widely, that is clear from all tax gap, all tax effort studies, that has the biggest potential of increasing DRM and tax. Again, does not discount, and it was said earlier, the symbiosis with administration, because you might have new legislation, but you might lack the proper regulation, and you might have, as Nara hinted to, also then undermining from the contract level where you state something different in terms of tax, the tax terms. And then what Nara also touched upon a bit, but which is actually a huge issue, are the large inconsistencies in current tax systems, involving, among other things, a multiplicity of complex layers of often eroding the tax base. So I think we're talking at least about 5-6 levels here. At the top level, you might have the constitution or the national legislation. Then you might have tax agreements of various natures. You might have free trade economic zones. You might have national investment centers, administrative orders, sector investor contract agreements. All of these, one or the other can overrule. So you might make progress in one. It could actually mean nothing unless it is harmonized towards the other levels. For example, in petroleum sector, it's very common that in the production sharing agreement, a lot of fiscal terms are set there, and they are set differently between the PSAs. And then it doesn't really matter if you have an income tax act or many other legislations, or unless this somehow then is clear that it overrules. Of course, in some instances, it can win the day. And there is an urgent need also to keep in mind that with these inconsistencies in the tax systems, you also have fiscal incident issues. So you might, it's not just to increase the tax type or the rate or the efficiency, but you need to look at the equality issues, the poverty issues linked to how you are currently taxing. It matters how tax is collected, from whom, and how the revenue is spent. So then a little bit, I will try to wrap up, but much of the above, of course, is linked to, of course, what Western world has been doing for decades in Africa. We have had our conditionalities. We have had a lot of pressure on privatization, foreign investor interest, no doubt. But let's keep in mind that tax is far down on the list for any investor coming into most countries. Especially if you talk about natural resources, it's the quality of the resource that matters. Not so much whether the effective tax rate is 40 or 55. That is secondary or tertiary or long down on the list. What matters is the quality of the resource. And all the other facilitating or enablers for the investment, such as red tape, electricity, water, roads, and what makes it possible to operate. So then I'll try to quickly wrap up. What can Norway offer in this discussion? I think we have had very good partnerships. We are now with Addis Tax Initiative doubling our efforts up to 2020 with a new strategy and plan, rolling out more initiatives on a global, hopefully regional and country level. It will be key also, however, to connect with existing development and economic governance work, because you're not going to make much program on DRM and tax unless somehow it is connected to the other things that are happening, because you need to build institutions, you need to have stronger governance overall if tax is going to work. We want to strengthen ownership in partner countries and with regional organizations such as AU, UNECA, ATAF, and others. So we look forward to that. And we want to support work both on global, regional, national for normative, technical, and capacity-related work, including IFF. We work with different stakeholders, and I'm happy to announce that we are relaunching also the work with the Norwegian Tax Authority. For the next 5 years, they will have gradually capacity to go out and have some institutional cooperation, partner hopefully with regional organizations as well, in 3 to 5 countries with more intense work, and in a wider group with targeted capacity building. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olaf. Our next speaker is Akin Adeniran, Rule of Law Advisor to the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to say or offer an award, except to my ambassador that is present, to anyone that can pronounce my first name correctly. It is Akingbolahan Adeniran. I thank you for having me here, and it's a pleasure indeed to be here to address you. I think I will talk about this topic from a slightly different perspective. I'll be addressing it from the area of what we can do regionally and internationally to surmount some of the challenges that we face in the field of illicit financial flows. And as you know, Nigeria is actually, taking a very strong and firm position in this area. One of the things that we've done in the past, in 2015, for example, at the 71st UN General Assembly, we co-sponsored 2 resolutions, one directly, focusing attention on illicit financial flows, and the second on the return of assets, of stolen assets to victim countries. And those are 2 resolutions we've tried to follow up on, since those resolutions. For example, in 2016, we had an international conference, and it was a conference on promoting international cooperation in combating illicit financial flows and enhancing asset recovery for sustainable development. And this resolution, or there was an Abuja declaration that basically itemized about 6 different areas, to be focused on in order to try and surmount some of the challenges. And I just want to draw on some of those, on declarations, some of those resolutions for a second. One of them was to extend scrutiny to all spheres of the chain to curb illicit financial flows, including sanctioning and prosecution of financial institutions who violate anti-corruption laws, as well as the employees. Now, I'm not talking only from the tax evasion, base erosion, or transfer mispricing perspective. I'm also going to address this topic by looking at corruption, money laundering, and other forms of illicit financial flows. And one of the things that I think from this first resolution is capacity building is very important in this area. And I think Dr. Nara and Olaf, they've talked a lot about what can be done domestically to enhance the capacity of the different players and different stakeholders to be able to tackle this issue effectively. So I won't dwell on that. Safe to say that particularly in the area of transfer mispricing, this is one aspect that a lot of capacity building needs to be done. And I think one area that we also need to focus on here is trying to galvanize international cooperation in this field so that it is generally accepted that this is one harmful practice to African development that can be addressed by the UN and other agencies. So one concrete resolution that was taken was perhaps to upgrade the Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters by transforming it into an intergovernmental body as a subsidiary of ECOSOC. And I think that's something that we can address, because if you look at most of the agencies internationally that deal with issues of illicit financial flows, if you look at the membership, there are very few African countries, that are members of such agencies. And in fact, Nigeria is only a member of one of them. And I think that's one of the areas by bringing, such bodies into a forum like ECOSOC, we tend to have, greater participation by African countries. Another resolution and aspect of the declaration was to hold international illicit financial flows facilitators and intermediaries, including international financial institutions, accountable. And I think this is an area that has eluded us for a number of years. We normally find individuals and we hold them accountable, but nothing is said of the financial institutions or the other intermediaries that enable it to happen. And I think we need to start in a conversation that tries to get at that, because until we start stopping the flow from the end of these institutions, it may forever continue. One may have in mind, we have an AU, African Court of Justice and Human Rights. And if you look at Article 28A of the protocol establishing the court, it tries to expand jurisdiction in criminal matters to cover issues like corruption, money laundering, trafficking in persons, trafficking in drugs, illicit exploitation of natural resources, and so on. And having such a body perhaps look into this area and be able to hold whatever institution, individual or institution, accountable, so long as there is that nexus with the African continent, I think it's something we should start taking seriously and something we should consider. If you can remember, that, for example, in the US, they have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which has, some extraterritorial jurisdiction and can hold, companies that maybe are not even registered in the US, but have some form of operation in the US. They can hold them accountable and sanction them and fine them, as the case may be. So this is an area I think we should talk about. And it's not necessarily to take away power from domestic jurisdiction. They will still have primacy. The African Court of Justice and Human Rights will only come into play where there are very egregious cases and domestic institution is unwilling or unable to handle same. I think one of the other areas is, of course, to increase increase advocacy around returns. Okay, so we always identify, we trace, we seize, we freeze the assets, and then we end up talking for years and years about the return of these assets. And I think, even in a domestic setting, when you talk about receiving stolen property, it is a crime. So why is receiving stolen assets from a victim country not a crime? And why do we have to debate it and talk about it, over and over again? And then we bring forward these legal or artificial barriers to prevent the return of these assets. And I think that's one area where we need greater advocacy. There is a particular index. It's called the Financial Secrecy Index. And it's a very, very nice index. It's just started, and the people at the top, or the countries at the top, are the worst in the world. Not to name and shame, but Switzerland is #1, and the US is #2. And I think to even expand this index to cover areas or countries that do not return these assets after it's been identified as stolen, and the African continent or the AU can champion this index. Transparency International, whenever they release their index, everyone is eagerly awaiting the outcome. Where is our country on this ranking? But then we don't scrutinize that index. For example, many of you will find it surprising to note that Transparency International relies on several other indices in order to, compute its own index. And one of the indices it relies on, for example, the World Justice Project Index, relies on Transparency International Index also. So it's like the Transparency International is relying on an index that relies on Transparency International's index, and then you wonder where, where the credibility lies in terms of where is the original work or the underlying work taking place. And so this is an area where, through advocacy and by highlighting the harmfulness, linking it to human rights, because when we talk about poverty alleviation, And we've linked, and we all know that corruption basically is a violation of human rights and fundamental rights. With knowledge that money is stolen and putting in place hurdles to prevent the return of such assets is a continuing violation of the rights of victim countries, of residents in victim countries. And those are barriers that we should start, to tear down. Countries need to make more effort to prevent the entry of illicit funds, and we need to start promoting transparency and involvement of civil society organizations in the use of returned assets. In Nigeria, for example, what we do is that there's a line in the budget for returned assets, so it's a revenue line, and it is dealt with as we deal with all revenue. So as you're that have been identified as stolen in an escrow account, which should be domiciled in a development bank. Why not the African Development Bank? Let us start insisting that it should be domiciled here while all the legal debates and everything, continues. At least let us make sure it is no longer in that country. Because we never talk about the interest rates and, what has been used, what the money has been used for in the meantime. And then, of course, we need to keep on supporting and to strengthen voluntary initiatives and mechanisms to promote transparency and accountability, like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the financial intelligence units, extending mandatory reporting requirements, and now we're talking about open beneficial ownership registries. And having a coalition of these efforts, which are mostly voluntary based, but at least as an interim, as we prepare to move into a more, legal and obligatory regime, hopefully with the AU and with the UN, supporting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Akin Bolahan. So I was able to pronounce your name.
Yeah. You get the award.
Our next speaker is Professor Annette Ugutu from the University of South Africa. Please, Prof.
Thank you for having me in this panel discussion. I'm glad for the invitation. I want to put a little bit of a spin in what we've been discussing today, and that is the increasing reduction in the dividing line between illicit financial flows and tax avoidance proper. Because there has been a call, for example, from the UN high-level panel report and backed by the World Bank report, that some of the activities that multinationals are getting involved in are bordering the dividing line between tax evasion and tax avoidance. Tax evasion being one of those illicit financial flows in addition to your corruption and whatnot. And and multinationals insisting that the likes of transfer pricing and treaty shopping and all that, which historically are, termed legal anti-avoidance, are now being looked at with suspicion as to whether they are not really illicit channels for illicit financial flows. I'll try to see how I link up this whole thing with the four, maybe three of the topics that have been pointed out, linkages between taxation and investment. And I'll major on double tax treaties. From way back after the First World War, there was already international trade taking place, and already multinationals or those that were involved in international trade were trying to find ways of how they can avoid taxes of the countries that were involved in. And back then, already countries that were wanted to rebuild after the World War, saw the loss of revenue that was taking place, and so there was a need to have double taxation treaties in place. The main purpose of them is to encourage international trade so that you don't have double taxation in the two countries. So you see that the preamble historically of double tax treaties has been about preventing double taxation. And double tax treaties, as we all know, are based on specific models. The most common of them is the OECD and the UN model, but we have a number of models that are developing in Africa. The ATF model, the East African Community has been working on a model, the SADC model, and so forth. But the typical ones, or the main ones, the OECD has been more in favor of developed countries, having been developed come on board and they want to resolve these issues. And so they work on the new preamble in the new OECD model now 2017 that covers not only double taxation, fiscal evasion, but also double non-taxation and tax avoidance and all issues pertaining to treaty abuse. The concern, though, is that most of the BEPS action plans, as we all know, where the agenda was developed by developing countries. And so you find that there is limit in there as to what is important to us as developing countries. The most pertinent one is the issue pertaining to excessive interest deductions. Treaty abuse is an important one, historical problem for developing countries, artificial avoidance of PE trade status, and of course transfer pricing issues that we've all been talking about. But the problem is the avenues or the measures the OECD is trying to come up with, most of them are not user-friendly or will not be easily applicable for African countries. If I might do some PR for ATAF, we have here a report suggesting how to draft interest deduction. And then also Norway came up with a new way of how to deal with, address issues pertaining to interest deductions, especially for debts that the Norway had with a number of African countries, the likes of Egypt, Somalia, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. And these are new measures that we as African countries should look at and not be boxed into exactly what the OECD has to offer. Yes, there are alternatives there, but if they are not user-friendly, like the EU says, let's come up with African problems, African solutions to African problems, picking on what has been provided, but of course, proceeding with what is more user-friendly for African countries, especially those that are not at the same development levels or have not been that involved in the BEPS programs. Now, with respect to preventing fiscal evasion, over the years, the model tax conventions have always had provisions relating to the exchange of information in tax matters. And as we know, the new standard has now been updated to the automatic exchange of information in tax matters. This also creates problems for African countries in terms of the fact that developed countries are concerned about protection of taxpayer rights, the fact that we have the resources in place to protect all that information that will be shared around. So as much as these avenues are available out there, we will be giving out the information that the West needs to prevent tax evasion and the abuse of their taxes, but it will be a long while before we are going to get information from these countries that will be beneficial for us. And yet, if you look at your Panama files, the Paradise files, I think we are doing so bad, unfortunately, with many of our politicians and high net worth individuals that are investing in all these tax havens. And of course, Africa and developing countries at large have been impacted on most gravely by illicit financial flows. So what am I trying to say here? Avenues and measures have been created internationally to deal with base erosion. And that brings me back to the dividing line I talked about, the slim dividing line between exactly what is tax evasion, what is avoidance. Multinationals and all sorts of whatevers have hidden in that gray line and really avoiding the taxes. But if we are going to stick with what is given to us to run with without adopting it to what is workable for our particular circumstances, and they are so different for different African countries, then we are not going to benefit much a lot. I am so glad that the likes of ATAP have taken the platform ahead to make sure that they adopt BEPS measures to suit the African developing countries concerned. The UN subcommittee has also worked a great deal to ensure that we actually deal with African tax issues. So the likes of Norway have been very helpful, and there are lots of other measures, international measures, the tax borders, tax inspectors without borders that we can rely on. But we need to take a step back as African countries and realize what is it that is really at stake in our particular countries. Is it interest deduction? Are we a type of country that is easily abused for tax treaties? PE is the main issue here. If you are a resource-rich country, transfer pricing should be a major concern. And what do we do to make sure that we address all these issues? I think I will stop there. I haven't touched on tax incentives, but maybe there will be an opportunity to talk with that later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ugutu. And now open it for comments, questions, responses. Who would like to go first? I know it's late in the day. It's been a long day. I'm sure this must have been excellent presentations that did not raise any controversy or
Thanks very much, Chair. I think all this discussion is very good, and I'm happy that we have somebody who is an advisor on the rule of law to our president. And the biggest issue for me is the greed. And like you said, Chair, in the previous session, looking at all the issues of corruption and how we try to call them differently, to massage them. I think once our leaders open up to reduce greed, then we'll have more of the types of advisors that are actually needed in order to address these issues. And then also, again, picking from the previous session, if we could build capacity in negotiation from home, so that in discussions on these issues with our partners from the Western world, from the developed world, we have a strong basis. We have informed discussions, and we are able to say the deal doesn't work for us, we are not taking it. I think will be very, very critical. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair. I am Swada De Nosman, Executive Director of the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, who recently picked up on the work of the high-level panel to support the Thabo Mbeki and the consortium, because the panel evolved into a consortium. I wanted to ask the advisor from Nigeria, the report, the recommendations of the high-level panel have been endorsed by the heads of state. They are therefore now decisions of heads of state. And you mentioned the importance of some of these recommendations to be implemented, and many of them actually require national level muscles and action. The return of stolen asset, or in African Development Bank, we don't talk about stolen asset, they want to talk about sovereign assets. The escrow account, the only experience we have was the Marcos case. There is no other case. What is missing for African member states to put that forward and try to get it done? For sure, for those of us who have been working with the high-level panel, we're not seeing much of efforts being done by our member states to help in that sense. The only instrument that exists is the ALSF, African Legal Support Facility, which is very weak in this. So we wonder what is missing for African member states to get those kind of advocacy going, so particularly when you have been introducing two resolutions at global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. These questions are coming from the right. There's no anything from the left wing this side. You are surrendering the space for the right wing. This is probably in line with the...
Get some socialist here.
Okay.
The left wing.
Minister. Honorable Minister.
No, I think, I guess, you know, in 17 months in government, and hearing the hue and cry about sort of political corruption, and then coming to the realization of the real elephant in the room being illicit flows, 50 increasing to 100 billion. And the question is why the global enterprise is not confronting that as, you know, literally the most important and obvious engagement that we could all have, to just begin to close that window, which could potentially then lead to the ripple effect, you know, of eliminating the others. It becomes a wonder for me as we go through discussions. And maybe the other issue is how African finance ministers should, at least in these major meetings that we have, always have, you know, a margin discussion on this specific thing, and compare notes, and also the issue of treaty shopping, so that maybe there's a very clear database in which we all put these agreements on, to enable a certain openness and maybe a certain shaming which would occur, would be some of the issues that sort of come to mind.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. Any other comments? I think maybe at this stage I could ask our panel members to either in the same order, or whoever want to take or comment on what was raised. I guess Nara, then Akin, and then I'll go this side.
Basically, this is just an, I guess I will push the question of the minister to you, actually, in terms of basically what but maybe, I guess we know that the African Union right now has made the theme of the 2018, the corruption. And I think those also to recognize already the importance of corruption, the corruption as one of those important ill of our continent that will actually assist in reducing the amount of illicit financial flows leaving our continent. So I'll just also wanted to also address the financial secrecy index that was raised by you, Hakim, earlier, just to say that they already approach actually us at ATAF to start working with to make sure that we are actually spreading the index, the financial secrecy index, to the African level. But I find your idea of actually including criminalizing the countries that actually keep the stolen asset once they have been identified as such, as part of the crime. And actually, if you'll allow me to actually bring that up to them when the time comes. Basically, those are the things I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. I think the question that was addressed to me specifically has to do with what we can do in order to address issues that were raised by the high-level panel. And also why have those issues not been given greater priority. I mean, I don't want to speak for any country, but I think one of the things that, we find in this area is that there are always so many problems, that, capture our attention. And just being able to identify which ones are priorities sometimes can be an issue. But now that we have a year that we've labeled the anti-corruption year, and we have our president as the anti-corruption champion, I think this is something that we can now go back into, draw up an agenda, and start to identify what should be priorities, because I agree with you that this should be an area of priority that we should focus on. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, Olaf.
Yes, very briefly. I think I just want to make comment on two. I mean, one maybe was not directed at me, but is this capacity at home for negotiations. I think that this is a really key issue. Norway was one of the main initial donors to the African Legal Support Facility. I think coming from Norway as well, of course, we are very aware, and I worked 9 years in Zambia and Tanzania on the mining sector and petroleum sector, and a lot on the fiscal and negotiation issues. And it's very clear to me that this is an area with big potential. It's an area where you really need the best expertise to be able to level the playing field. And it's an area where a lot more could be done. It's an area where sometimes we find ourselves, of course, on both sides of the table. I mean, we might have Statoil or others that are in licenses or in. So we will need, I think, in many issues to support, African initiatives or international initiatives where you can have the best people coming together and having a clear transfer of capacity and ownership. And then the second one is a very tricky one to answer from the Minister of Finance from Ghana, and says, why are we not holding the global enterprise accountable? Well, this is a big discussion in our own countries, also linked to our own fiscal base, actually. Because this is a global crisis, I would say, in many ways, that has been discussed, and there's a longer discussion, but that is linked to the recurrence of financial crisis. It's linked to the growing inequality that we see. It's linked to undermining of democracy and the state as such in the Western world and in many other parts of the world. So I would say that this is a very, very deep question in a way. I'm seeing progress and signs of optimism in some way, because there are new things happening in terms of transparency linked to the use of tax havens. There are, in terms of beneficial ownership registries, there are also with the OECD, BEPS actions, there are things that are going in the right direction. But ultimately, of course, it has to do with power. It has to do with who is and who has interests. And let's be very clear. I mean, those powers and interests are also in our own countries and doesn't always coincide with what some politicians might say, or even the government or our prime minister, for example. But we are working on this. I think together more progress could be made. And I think keep on sort of asking that question, because of course, unless it changes on our side as well, it will be hard to really address this problem overall. Thank you.
I think on my part, what I would say is that we could jump as high as we can regarding all the issues we are discussing, but it all boils down to political will. And some of us that are mere mortals in here and can't really change much, but those of us that have got the power to influence our ministers of finance and our presidents and so forth, just to make them understand how important these issues are. Because the community at large, non-government organizations, civil society, is concerned about the euphoria that is going on internationally, and that many African countries are dragging their feet regarding responses to some of these issues. The opportunities are available, the funding is available. It's no longer a case where, you know, you go on it all by your own as it was in the past. We've been suffering with issues regarding illicit financial flows and base erosion for years. The opportunity is available now. Can we come on board? Why should the likes of ETAF be begging countries all the time, please join us? Yes, I understand there are political and policy issues, whatever, that must be dealt with. And that's why I'm saying that those of us that, if you got the power, let's influence our politicians to do what they can. I mean, in the West, nothing could be done until political will took place and you had, you know, all of them coming together to deal with the BEPS issues. I think that is what we need in Africa. We need our countries to come on board and work on these issues if we are going to see change in Africa.
Thank you very much, Annette. I think since I don't see other hands, maybe we can move to the next part of our agenda. But before that, I just wanted to maybe make a brief comment on what His Excellency, the Honorable Minister, talked about the Ministers of Finance. Why are they not discussing this? I think the panel itself, it came about because of the engagement of the ministers. And they put it together and all that, and you have the report. But I think that is only the first part of it. We really would like to see champions like yourself, Excellency, to talk to your colleagues and see how they can have this issue in the agenda constantly, like what the head of state in the summit asked President Becky to report annually. If the ministers also make this as an undertaking, that in every annual meeting of Conference of Ministers, they raise it as an item, will be extremely important for the continent, and particularly taking it as a development issue will be very useful. I think with this, let us move to the next part of the agenda, which first we are going to have a launch of 2 ECA publications. Item this will not be followed by any discussion. You just tell us there are 2 studies outside here, we can collect them. So please.
Thanks, Abdullah. I know I have 5 minutes. The 2 studies were prepared in response to the recommendations of the high-level panel report on illicit financial flows. So 3 areas were identified for action. 1, research, evidence-based research, and 2, capacity development. 3, advocacy. So in terms of research, we prepared 2 studies. One study prepared by ECA, different divisions were involved, African Mineral Development Center and Macroeconomic Policy Division, and the other study was prepared by the Macroeconomic Policy Division. I would like to recognize here by 3 divisions of ECA actually, and I would like to recognize here the contribution made by Professor Ogoto to the study on PEPs. Very quickly, I will go to the key messages and policy recommendations of the 2 studies. The first study was on the global governance architecture for combating illicit financial flows. The second one was on base erosion and profit shifting in Africa, looking at OECD base erosion and profit shifting actions and their appropriateness for Africa. The studies used literature reviews and country case studies from Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, South Africa, and Tanzania. The key messages from the first study on global financial architecture are that there are many elements of global governance on illicit financial flows, but the architecture remains incomplete. not comprehensive. These elements are often not well coordinated, so coordination is an issue. And Africa is underrepresented in global fora for addressing illicit financial flows. And the perpetrators of illicit financial flows can always benefit from gaps in global architecture. The second study on base erosion and profit shifting in Africa has the key messages, 4 key messages also. Base erosion and profit shifting practices are harmful to development and should be considered part of illicit financial flows. There is a debate here I don't have time to go into. OECD work on BEPS is helpful, but it's not complete. Professor Ogoto mentioned some of the factors. I will also mention a few of them. Individual African countries need to judge whether specific OECD BEPS actions are in their interest. I know about 17 African countries are included in the OECD work on BEPS, but some of the issues that need to be addressed are the priority for Africa's addressing granting non-strategic tax incentives and harmful tax competition. 1, 2, weak tax administration capacity and governance is another issue. Third issue is public financial management in Africa, which is not a subject of great interest elsewhere, and the benefit from the work of the UN on tax treaties and the UN Model Tax Convention on Income and on Capital, and its definition of the permanent establishment concept. So we need to benefit from this UN work. In terms of policy recommendations, I know I have less than 1 minute. We need to establish a mechanism that coordinate global efforts, increase pressure on financial secrecy jurisdictions, grant greater representations to Africa in this international forum. And this should be done by establishing UN global tax body. I think a lot of people are talking about it globally, and pursue opportunities for inter-African sharing of tax information, creating African Technical Tax Committee, and pursue African agreements against harmful tax competition. There is a lot of talk about this in the context of AFCFTA, establishing national tax committees and IFF action plans, and establishing and capacitating accountable anti-IFF enforcement agencies at national and regional level. And for capital importing African countries, implement PEPS actions, not going to talk about detail, eliminate non-strategic tax incentives, and establish transfer pricing and anti-trade misinvoicing rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next presentation is on ATAF products used to address illicit financial flows from Africa by Dr. Nara Monkam. Nara, please.
I promise you, Dr. Hamdok, that I'll just take maybe 2 minutes, but don't start the chrono yet. So, so ladies and gentlemen, it's just to present to you the models, the African models I just talked about. So basically, we have 3 of them. We have the African model used to basically to assist our African countries to draft interest deductibility rules in their tax legislation. We also have the African model used to actually assist our countries to actually draft a transfer pricing legislation, and we also have our African model DTA. Those are some ATAF products that basically assist our member countries in strengthening, in drafting, strengthening, and also basically improving the tax legislation in the countries. But what I want to say, and again, I want to join my voice to Professor Ogutu and Dr. Hamdok earlier by saying that all those products are wonderful, but they will gather dust if they are not championed by our political leaders, basically. So we need, and that's where we'll also like to acknowledge His Excellency, the Honorable Minister of Finance of Ghana here present. to assist us in basically bringing this product at the political level, to assist in the adoption of those products, because our tax administration keep on telling us, stop preaching to the choir. We know the importance of these things, but we need you to bring these products to the political arena so that it can be adopted not only at the country level, but at regional level. And that's why we really thank the honorable minister here present and all the ministers that assist in basically supporting the initiatives the tax initiative that we implemented basically in their countries, and we're really grateful for that. So, and we also have the African Tax Outlook. Basically, I want to say that this is a product by African and for Africans. So for once we have basically 32 tax administration that came together to actually harmonize the tax statistics on the continent, to assist in assessing the performance of the tax administration, but also allow for comparison across countries. They decided on those tools themselves, and which basically strengthen the ownership. Because I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, but they say that some of our member countries come to us and they say that when the IMF comes to collect data, everything stops for 1 week. We give them the data, and then we never use those data again. So for once, they have data that they can use not only to allow for comparison, but also that they are using in their daily work. So 32 African countries came together, and we're actually expanding the coverage as we speak. So those are the tools that, again, I'm encouraging the ECA and all the institutions to bring it at the highest level so that we can spread the coverage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nara. I think this brings us to the last item in our agenda, which is the closing remarks. I have here the partners who have got together to prepare this side event. We'll listen to them. I think you have 2 minutes each. Your final thought on this, Adam, from ECA.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think we, as ECA, already expressed our gratitude to the partners and welcome them also to this meeting. So I think I will give the floor to our partners. I'll give my time to the partners.
Thank you very much, Adam. Next, Nara.
Dr. Hamdong, I think I've said my piece already. Again, the championing of African tax issues at the highest political level, because everything is being done at the African tax administration level, and we now need to have that extra impetus, extra momentum to be brought at the political level, as you said earlier, as a fundamental development issue, as a fundamental sources of sustainable development in our continent. We have a tool that will assist us in financing our own development agenda, and that's domestic resource mobilization, which important component, one important component is taxation. And then for that, it is basically a development agenda issue, and that has to be brought at the forefront. Thank you.
Very much. Olaf.
Not much to add, really. I mean, I think we are fully in line. I think from our side, what we'd like to emphasize, perhaps, is the importance of linking, a bit like Nara was saying, these initiatives to when we discuss the overall frame agreement with AU, frame agreement with UNECA, and also in countries and on the global level, we are discussing economic governance, PFM issues, tax issues, that we remember to bring these things together. Because sometimes, you know, we might support the IMF on some issues, we might support the OECD, we might do country-specific work, and we might not be able to sort of bring these things together in the best way. I think you are very well placed here in Addis to ensure this coordination, and I see that you are taking charge more and more of these issues. It links to trade, it links to integration in the region, it links to potential for independence and for deciding on your own development. So I think we would just like to join that movement and see if to what extent we can support and collaborate and make sure that these other threads of support are not contravening but moving in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olaf. I think For me also, I don't think there is much I need to add here. But looking back 5 years ago, we were struggling on how to define illicit finance. Is it illicit? Is it licit? How does it link to capital flight? And all this. The debate has moved on. Nobody today is questioning this. It is firm in the agenda. For us in Africa, it's a development issue. And as Nara puts it, it's a development issue that we would like to work together with our partners. And I think working together, we will be able to stem it. It is extremely unfortunate that the poor part of the world is subsidizing the rich. This is scandalous, and we have to arrest it. But working together, we will be able to stop that. So thank you very much for the panel members, for all of you. You want to say something? Oh, I'm sorry.
I really don't have much to add, but maybe I should just want to appreciate UNECA for involving expertise on the African ground to be involved in these things. For me, it is a great day indeed that Africa is taking charge of its own issues. Because before, our issues were being interpreted for us by other people who don't understand our issues. But now we are coming on board and we can interpret the international issues from our own perspective. And we are getting confidence in our own selves. We can write our own reports. We can have a voice out there that says that, okay, you set the agenda, but you won't spoon-feed me as to what the agenda will be. This is my issue, and this is how I want to deal with this. For me, this is a great day, a great dawn for Africa, and I'm so happy to be part of it. Thank you.
Very much, and I think in this same vein, I remember well in 2010, when first time we talked about this illicit finance. Actually, in the whole continent, we had one report prepared by Global Financial Integrity, and that was the reference. There was nothing. When we talked to President Thabo Mbeki to convince him to take on board this responsibility, we could only share with him that report. You can imagine in these 5 years how much an amount of literature and the research and the studies. This illicit finance is not a new issue. It has been there forever, I think, from whenever globalization started, probably going back even to slave trade. But it has been hidden. I think in 5 years we are really moving in the right direction. But I'm sure we are confident that we will be able, working together, we will stem it. Again, thank you very much, and I thank our panelists, and thank you for all of you. Thank you, Honorable Minister, for keeping you late. It's almost 6 o'clock on a Sunday, but I think as good sons and daughters of this continent and the world, we are confident that we will together stem this out. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. And don't forget, tomorrow we will have the ministerial. The ministers will be meeting from tomorrow morning, and on a very interesting issue also on the continental free trade area and the fiscal space for jobs and transformation of the continent. So please, if you have time, come and join into those discussions. There will be excellent plenaries and exchange of views and ideas. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tea, coffee outside. Thank you. Have a great evening.